For 10 years, Isabella Grant mourned the husband she thought she knew, until one rainy morning, she unlocked the door to his forbidden garage, and stepped into a world of betrayal, stolen fortunes, and a secret so dangerous it might still come for her. The rain had been falling since before dawn, drumming softly against the wide kitchen windows. Isabella Grant stood at the counter, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee she'd been nursing for nearly an hour. 10 years. That was how long she had been a widow. 10 long, hollow years in a house that felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Her gaze wandered toward the hallway at the far end of the kitchen, the one that led to the garage. The door was shut, as it had always been. Once, that door had represented something ordinary. A simple barrier to her husband's so-called private sanctuary. Now, after a decade of dust and silence, it loomed like the locked entrance to another world. When her husband, Richard, had been alive, the garage had been strictly off-limits. He had said it in the early days of their marriage with an easy smile that disguised the firmness of his tone. "You don't need to see what's in there, Bella. It's my space, my retreat." She had thought it was harmless, maybe even endearing, a sign that he valued a corner of privacy in their shared life. But as the years passed, his refusals hardened. Even when she offered to help organize it, he snapped in a way that cut her to the bone. After he died in a car accident, she left the garage untouched. The lock stayed in place, the keys forgotten in a tin on top of the refrigerator. At first, it had been out of grief. She could not bear the thought of touching his things. Later, it became something else. A habit of avoidance. A quiet pact with herself that whatever secrets the garage held could stay buried. But now, 10 years later, she had made a decision. The house was too big, too full of memories that clung to her skin like damp air. She had found a smaller place closer to Portland, and the sale of this house was already in motion. Which meant, for the first time, she would have to face the one room she had avoided all these years. That Thursday morning, the rain felt like an omen. She finished her coffee, pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, and walked to the kitchen drawer. Inside was the key ring, the old brass key to the garage still dull and cold to the touch. She stared at it for a long moment, her breath catching in her throat, before slipping it into her palm and heading down the hallway. The door groaned when she turned the key. The smell hit her first, stale air tinged with a faint scent of oil and rust. The creak of the hinges seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet house. She pushed the door open fully, her eyes adjusting to the dim light filtering through a single narrow window. And then she froze. The walls were covered in photographs. Dozens, maybe hundreds, tacked and taped in uneven rows. Not of her. Not of their daughter, Emily. They were all of the same woman. She was in different outfits, different places. Sometimes laughing, sometimes posing as if she knew she was being watched. Some shots were candid, taken from a distance, while others looked intimate, like they had been taken from just a few feet away. Isabella's hand tightened around the keys until the metal dug into her palm. Her heart beat unevenly, each thud echoing in her ears. She stepped further inside, the cold concrete floor pressing through her socks. The workbench at the back of the garage was cluttered, but one small box drew her eye. It was a jewelry box, pale blue with gold trim, the kind her grandmother used to keep on her vanity. She reached for it, her fingers trembling. The moment the lid lifted, the air seemed to shift. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a diamond necklace. Her grandmother's necklace. The one that had gone missing 12 years ago. She remembered searching for it for weeks, how Richard had shaken his head, telling her she must have misplaced it. She remembered crying over it, not just for the loss of the jewelry, but because it was the last thing her grandmother had given her before passing. Her mouth went dry. He gave it to her. The woman in the photographs. On the workbench beside the box was a stack of envelopes bound with twine. She untied them with unsteady hands, the paper brittle with age. Letters. Dozens of them. They were written in a familiar hand, Richard's, but addressed to someone else. The words were intimate, affectionate. They spoke of shared vacations, weekend getaways, and a life together that Isabella had never been part of. A chill spread through her as she read the names. His second wife. 2 children. Vancouver. A whole second life lived just across the border while she stayed here, raising their daughter alone, believing he was away for work. The rain outside intensified, rattling against the garage window. Isabella's breathing quickened, her mind racing to piece together a puzzle she never knew existed. Her hands shook as she found more: receipts for private school tuition, photographs of beach trips, and plane tickets. And then she saw it, a manila folder tucked beneath a rusted toolbox. Inside were insurance policies, her name scrawled in signatures she had never written. She scanned the documents, her stomach turning as the truth came into focus. Richard had increased his life insurance policy just 2 months before his death. But there was also a cancellation notice, supposedly signed by her years ago, waiving a larger payout. The signature was a forgery, shaky but deliberate. Her breath caught. He had been preparing to leave her. Preparing to leave her with nothing. A car accident had stopped him before he could finish whatever plan he had set in motion. Fate had stepped in where she had been blind. But now, as the rain poured and the garage stood silent around her, Isabella knew one thing: grief was no longer part of this. Whatever sorrow she had carried for 10 years was gone, replaced by a cold, focused clarity. She closed the jewelry box, slid the letters back into their twine, and stepped out of the garage. Her hands were steady now. She knew exactly what she needed to do next. She would not be his victim any longer. The rain did not let up for the rest of the day. By nightfall, the sky was a dark curtain, and the streetlights glowed like dim beacons through the mist. Isabella sat at her kitchen table, the jewelry box beside her, the stack of letters spread out in a neat line. She had read them twice already, each time feeling the burn of betrayal seep deeper into her bones. She could still hear Richard's voice in her head, warm and persuasive, telling her about long weekends away for work, about late meetings that kept him from family dinners. She had believed him, even defended him when friends asked why he was never around. Now she knew those weekends had been with her replacement, a woman who, by all appearances, had no idea she existed. She pulled her laptop closer and began typing in the names she had seen in the letters. The second wife's name came up quickly. Photos of her smiling on a front porch, children on either side, a man's arm draped across her shoulders. Richard's arm. The sight of it sent a jolt through Isabella's chest. The house in the background was large and tidy, set against a manicured lawn. She recognized the address from property records she found minutes later. It was purchased 15 years ago, the deed held jointly by Richard and this other woman. Purchased with her inheritance. That realization hardened her resolve. It was not enough to be angry. Anger without action was just more wasted time. She needed facts, proof, and a strategy. The next morning, she made a call to an old acquaintance, Peter Lang, a private investigator she had met through a friend during a neighborhood burglary years ago. Peter's voice was warm but cautious when he answered. She told him she needed help uncovering a hidden life, and within hours, they met in the corner booth of a small cafe that smelled of cinnamon and strong coffee. Peter listened without interrupting, his notepad filling quickly as she recounted everything she had found in the garage. When she was done, he tapped the pen against the table and gave a slow nod. "This is going to hurt, Isabella, but you have to see it all. Are you ready for that?" She met his gaze and answered without hesitation. "Yes." Over the next 2 weeks, Peter worked quietly but thoroughly. He sent her photographs, financial records, school enrollment documents. The story unfolded in brutal clarity. Richard had been splitting his life between 2 cities, 2 women, 2 sets of children. Every lie he had told her had been part of a larger design, one aimed at replacing her entirely. The hardest photographs to look at were not of Richard and the other woman together. They were of the children. 2 bright-eyed teenagers with his unmistakable features. His jawline, his dark hair, his smile. They were innocent in all of this, just as her daughter Emily had been. On a cold Saturday morning, Peter called with something new. "Isabella, you need to see this in person." He gave her an address in Vancouver, the same one she had seen in her research. Her pulse quickened as she agreed to meet him there. By early afternoon, she stood across the street from the house. It was even larger in person, with ivy creeping up one side and a white swing swaying gently on the porch. The second wife, Claire, stepped out carrying a bag of groceries. She looked younger than Isabella had imagined, with soft features and a weary expression, like someone used to carrying too much alone. Peter joined her on the sidewalk, keeping his voice low. "She has no idea about you." In her mind, she was married to Richard for 18 years. She thinks he died coming back from a business trip. The information hit Isabella like a wave. Claire was not an enemy. She was another casualty. That night, Isabella sat awake in her living room, the rain now replaced by a biting wind outside. She thought about confronting Claire directly, but the anger inside her was tangled with something unexpected: empathy. They had both been lied to, used, manipulated. But while Claire had been given comfort and financial stability, Isabella had been left to scrape together a life for herself and Emily. Still, there was more to uncover. Peter had also found documents showing the $2.5 million insurance payout Richard's second family had received. Money that should have been hers if not for the forged cancellation. Isabella's hands tightened around the papers. This was no longer about betrayal alone. It was about theft. The next step came with its own risk. She contacted an attorney, a sharp-eyed woman named Dana Keller who specialized in estate disputes. Dana listened carefully, her questions precise. Her tone clipped in a way that suggested she saw the outlines of a winnable case. With the right evidence, Dana explained, they could prove fraud, recover the payout, and potentially seize assets bought with Isabella's inheritance. The process would not be easy. They would have to dig into bank statements, insurance records, and property transfers. They would need sworn statements from handwriting experts about the forgery. They would also need to brace for the possibility that Claire and her children would be dragged into the fight. Isabella agreed without hesitation. She had lived in silence for 10 years, believing she had lost everything. Now, for the first time, she felt the ground under her feet again. The weeks that followed were a blur of paperwork, depositions, and late-night calls with Dana. Peter delivered more evidence. Emails between Richard and his insurance broker, notes about shifting funds between accounts, and a particularly damning document showing the down payment on Claire's house came directly from a trust that had once been in Isabella's name. One evening, after reviewing yet another set of legal briefs, Isabella found herself holding the diamond necklace again. The cold sparkle of the stones caught the lamplight, and a thought struck her. This necklace had been stolen, given to another woman, and yet here it was, back in her hands. It was a reminder that not everything Richard had taken was gone forever. By the time winter began to thaw into early spring, the case was ready to move forward. Dana filed the claim, and the storm broke in public. Claire learned the truth in a single devastating meeting with her attorney. Her world collapsing in much the same way Isabella's had when she first opened the garage door. But in the unraveling of lies, something unexpected began to take shape. Claire called Isabella. Her voice was unsteady, but there was no hostility in it. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I thought he loved me." Isabella's answer was quiet. "He lied to both of us." They met in person a week later, sitting across from each other in a small tea shop. At first, the conversation was stiff, guarded. But as the hours passed, they began to piece together their overlapping timelines, each revelation another thread in Richard's web of deceit. It was in that meeting that Isabella saw the first glimmer of something new, a strange alliance formed not out of friendship, but out of shared betrayal. Claire wanted justice too, though for her it was as much about reclaiming dignity as it was about money. When Isabella left the tea shop that evening, the wind was sharp but the sky was clear. For the first time in a decade, she felt something close to strength, maybe even hope. But there was still one part of the story that remained in shadow, the reason Richard had risked everything to live two lives, and what else he might have hidden that even now had yet to come to light. She suspected the answers were still out there. And she intended to find them. The lawsuit tore through the quiet lives of everyone involved like a storm that refused to pass. Newspapers picked up the story, splashing it across headlines in bold letters that made strangers whisper when Isabella walked into cafes or stood in grocery store lines. She ignored the stares. Every day was a step toward reclaiming what had been stolen from her. Dana was relentless in court. She presented the forged signature alongside expert testimony, introduced bank records showing transfers from Isabella's inheritance account into the down payment for Claire's home, and even displayed photographs of the stolen necklace as a symbol of personal loss. The insurance company, eager to avoid public scandal, turned on the second family's claim quickly. Claire sat 2 rows behind Isabella through much of the trial, her face pale but composed. They rarely spoke in the courthouse, but when their eyes met, there was a silent recognition. They were not fighting each other, but the ghost of the man who had played them both. By the 3rd week, the tide shifted in Isabella's favor. The judge ordered the $2.5 million payout returned to the rightful beneficiary, Isabella, along with legal costs. The stolen jewels were formally recognized as her property. More than the money. The ruling was a declaration that she had been wronged, and that wrong was now acknowledged in the eyes of the law. The victory should have felt final, but as Isabella walked out of the courthouse into the pale spring sunlight, there was no sense of closure. She had gained back what Richard had taken, but questions lingered like shadows that refused to move with the light. It was Peter who found the first hint of those answers. He appeared at her door one evening, his coat damp from rain, holding a battered leather journal. Found it in a storage unit under his name in Vancouver. You might want to read it. Alone in her living room, Isabella opened the journal and began to read. It was not a diary, but a meticulous record of transactions, names, and cryptic notes. Some entries detailed payments to unknown accounts overseas, others referred to meetings with people she had never heard of. But one name kept appearing, Malcolm Hart, a name that carried a sense of weight even on the page. The entries painted a picture of more than just infidelity. Richard had been involved in something larger, business dealings that skirted legality, investments funneled through shell companies. And Malcolm Hart, whoever he was, seemed to have been at the center of it. The next day, Peter traced the name. Malcolm Hart was a real estate developer with a reputation for shady deals and a history of making problems disappear. He had gone bankrupt 3 years ago and vanished from public view. Isabella could have stopped there. She had her money, her property, her vindication. But the thought of Richard's double life ending at mere infidelity felt incomplete. If there were deeper secrets, she needed to know. It was during this search that something unexpected began to weave into her days. Peter, with his steady patience and quiet wit, had become more than just an investigator. He checked in on her not just about the case but about how she was sleeping, eating, feeling. The walls she had built over 10 years of widowhood began to shift. She found herself smiling when he called, lingering in conversations that had nothing to do with Richard or the past. Still, the mystery of Malcolm Hart remained. Weeks passed before Peter returned with news. Hart had been spotted in a small town along the Oregon coast, living under a different name. Isabella made the decision to confront him. They drove down together, the ocean wind cutting through the narrow streets. Hart lived in a weathered cottage at the edge of town. When he opened the door, his eyes narrowed at the sight of her. He tried to close it, but Peter's foot blocked the way. "I knew Richard Grant," Isabella began, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I know about the second family. I know about the money. I want to know what else he was hiding." Hart's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might slam the door anyway. Then he stepped back and gestured for them to come in. The cottage smelled of salt and stale tobacco. Hart leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "Richard was into more than you think," he said finally. "It started with property deals, but it didn't end there. He was moving money for people you don't want to know about. When he died, a lot of people lost a lot of money." Isabella felt the weight of his words settle in her chest. This was the missing piece, the reason Richard had been so careful, so secretive. He had not just been building a second life for himself. He had been running from people who could ruin him. Hart's gaze sharpened. They might still come looking. And if they think you know something, they'll come to you. That night, back in her own home, Isabella stood in the garage once more. The walls of photographs still hung where she had first found them, the air heavy with the ghosts of secrets. She thought about the life she had rebuilt, the strength she had reclaimed, and the fact that some parts of Richard's story might never be fully uncovered. When she locked the garage door again, it was not out of fear. It was because she understood something now. Some truths were not meant to be fully unearthed. And yet, the possibility that someone might one day knock on her door looking for what Richard had left behind lingered in her mind like a shadow she could never quite outrun. Peter called the next evening. "Dinner tomorrow." She smiled faintly. "Yes." But as she hung up the phone, her gaze drifted toward the garage door. The lock was in place, the key resting in her pocket. The storm, she knew, might not be over,